Welcome. It is January the 1st, 2023, the start of a new year. And I think that, even leading up to Christmas, this thinking begins to pervade our minds, and that is that we start to take stock of the year. We start to look at the events of the year and begin to sort of summarize what happened in 2022. A lot went on. And, when you look in those terms, you begin to be very reflective and maybe a little sentimental. But when I look at 2022, I see a pretty eventful year. We had the full spectrum of world events. The pandemic was sort of in its waning months, but it still had a profound effect. We had the convoy that took over downtown Ottawa. We had the war that started in Ukraine, and at this point is still raging. The economy, inflation, rising interest rates, all of those things, dominated the headlines. Then you also had, on a more personal level, we saw that in 2022, we lost some dear loved ones. In our congregation, we had many families that experienced a real loss. And, so we enter this new year almost with a sense of, wow, this is the first year without. And that creates sort of not a sobering kind of approach to this, but it does make us take stock. And it's not to say that everything in 2022 was a downer. There were a lot of amazing things that took place. We had a VBS camp that saw 17 kids accept Christ as their Savior. That's amazing. Freedom sessions at the church saw some incredible expressions with the hand of God bringing people healing in their lives. That was amazing. We had the Nawash House of Prayer here on 2 separate occasions, and that had an amazing impact as we considered what we can do to bring reconciliation between Canada and, its native people. There were babies being born. We had our first grandson. All of these things were amazing events, and they were encouraging. But what it says, too, is that any given year can have its highs and its lows, choices to be made, direction to be sought. So how do you navigate that well? And that really led us to what we felt was going to be our text for the year. And it's found in Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. It's the classic passage when it comes to seeking direction and knowing God's plan going forward. It reads like this: "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him," and another version says acknowledge him, but I've come to appreciate that submit is probably a better preferred reading. Acknowledging God in your life and in your ways can be almost seen as a token, sort of, yep, God, I'm tracking with you. Submitting to him in all of our ways means we have to choose his way for our way. And then it sums it up and it says, and he will make your paths straight. When we think of this verse, it really breaks down into 4 neat sections, and we're going to be looking at those week by week as we go through the month of January. But then we'll take a week and bring all of the pieces back together and consider what that means for us as a church body and as individuals tracking through 2023. So let's get into it. The first section that we want to consider is trust in the Lord with all your heart. And I think, when I consider this passage and when I consider that particular part of the verse, to me, the thing that stands out is trust in the Lord with all your heart. We live in busy times, and the net effect of being in busy times is that we're always or regularly doing things with divided interests, or maybe another way to put it is divided attention. There's very few things that we can just zero in on, devote ourselves to them without having something in the background, like a tune that's always just playing. Got to do this. Got to have that getting done. And it's on the one hand, it can create the sense that we get really good at multitasking, but I'm not sure it's that. I think what ends up happening is we split our interests, and the problem ends up being is that we never get a sense of being singularly focused or fully devoted to that one thing. And then that just creates mixed results. There's times when we are more focused than not, and so you can really get something that you feel like you've given a lot to it. But then there's other times when you really feel like I didn't get anything done well, and everything sort of has that just kind of done, finished feel to it. We can't trust the Lord in that way. It would be like, keeping one foot on the bank and one foot in a canoe. That just guarantees a bad outcome. I've tried it, believe me. There's that moment when you realize, I'm not going to be able to pull these two together. Wow. And that oftentimes, I think, becomes how it plays out with our faith. We're wanting to lean on something, but we're also knowing that we need to trust in the Lord. And there becomes this point when we realize we can't bring it back together and make it one. We're either going to lean on one or lean on the other. And in the effort of trying to do both, we get that mixed result again. When it comes to trusting in the Lord, it's almost laughable, but then it's not, because anything that we might trust in compared to Him really does come out short. I'm going to trust in myself versus trusting in the Lord. Who do I think I am? I'm going to trust in the systems of this world, the governments, and all of those kinds of things. We have to function within those, but to fully trust them means that they're fully trustworthy. And we know that government is made up of men and women just like us, who are fallible, who have varied interests, sometimes known, sometimes not. And so we don't get a fully trustworthy system, and we shouldn't expect it. So what do we choose to do? When we're looking for direction, I'm going to trust here, I'm going to trust there, it's really hard to know what to do. It's almost like we're going for a hike, and we've brought multiple means of seeking direction with us. We have our compass, and it can guide you. We've got GPS. You can know exactly where you are. We have maps. If you're traveling during the day, you can look to see where the sun is. If you're traveling at night, you can look to see where the stars are. Moss grows on the north side of a tree. You can use your memory to where you've been before, which only works really well if you remember having been here before. You can check to see which way the wind is blowing. You can look for landmarks. There are all kinds of ways that you can seek direction, seek to know where you are and then where you want to be. But you would never try to incorporate all of those together. The net effect of doing so would probably be frustration and confusion. The compass says one thing, the GPS says I'm here, trying to remember being here, doesn't look like I've been here before. Is that the north side of the tree? Oh, that tree has moss all the way around it. Do you see? And I think sometimes we can fall into the trap of running our lives that way. We're running here and there and looking for good pieces of advice, and particularly if we're wanting to make a big decision, how do you know when you've got it? How do you know when you're tracking well? And by the same token, we may ask ourselves, well, Gary, you're making it sound like trusting in the Lord is just a simple thing. It isn't always easy to do that. In fact, how do we learn to trust with singular devotion so that we can know I'm in His will, I'm following His path, I'm going where I should? And I think there's a couple of things that we need to throw into the mix here when it comes to this passage and what it means for us in our day-to-day lives. Again, it says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will direct your paths, or He will make your paths straight. When we're looking to God for direction, it's almost a twofold thing. We want to have His general sense of that's the way we're going, a pointing kind of a thing. But then there's also the way in which God kind of functions like guardrails. And what I mean is this. There's we're going in that direction, but then there's the guardrails that keep you from going, ooh, I like that over there. Or, ooh, that looks nice. Do you see? There's the general sense of direction that, can point us in our long-term view for where, we should go with our lives. We often seek, God's will for us when we're younger in terms of a career or, choosing a spouse or, should we buy that house or this house? But then, when it comes to the day-to-day things of life, I think there's also something to be said. There's something profound that needs to be said for God keeping us moving forward and not being waylaid by temptations, by, distractions all around us. It's like we need to know the direction we're going, but also we need guardrails to keep us from going there or falling off the edge here. So when it comes to God's guidance in our lives, it is directional, but it's also a sustaining guidance that keeps us on the right path, keeps us from, choosing a fork in the road that, in any given day might lead to disastrous results, falling into sin, falling into temptation, making horrible decisions of one form or another. We need God's guardrails. How do we learn to have that aspect in our lives more? How do we learn to trust the Lord with all our heart? I believe there's some tangibles here. First off, let me say this. Trusting in the Lord is almost like a skill that needs to be developed. Oftentimes we make it sound like it's this nebulous, I trust the Lord kind of a thing, when actually it can be very, very practical. I think here's some ways to help us learn to trust better. I think, first of all, if we're going to trust the Lord, we need to recognize his voice in our lives. We have to be acquainted personally with him, learning to recognize his voice. And that comes about in a number of ways. Reading his word, praying, worship. These aren't just static exercises. I've read my devotion. I've thought about it. I'm carrying on with my day. It doesn't work like that. Prayer isn't now I lay me down to sleep. Lord, you've heard everything I've said. Thanks. Bye. It's not that. Prayer is a conversation. Lord, I'm concerned about this. What do you think about that? And then learning to listen for his voice, his guidance. And it can come in a lot of different ways, grant you that. But hearing God's voice really does become pivotal to knowing how to seek God's way for our lives and how to trust him. Worship. When we're singing and when we're, maybe just quietly meditating, worship can come in many forms. I love to worship God when I'm going for a hike, seeing the wonders of creation around me and knowing my God made those things. They didn't just randomly appear in the midst of the cosmos. They didn't evolve into this form. God made them. So what does it mean when I look at the filaments and the extensive forms of say even the needles of a tree? You can look at something in creation and go, or you can look at it and go, wow. You can marvel at creation. And in that, your heart is directed to worship. Do you see? When we consider just how vast our God is, when we appreciate all that there is about him, it pushes us in the direction of trusting him more. When we hear his voice, we can learn to appreciate his guidance in it. Similarly, when we become, acquainted with God in this way, the other thing that we need to do is to surround ourselves with people who are doing the same thing. Because what that does is we learn to then lean on God, and we learn from others as to how they've done that. We learn to do it together, looking for guidance together. Praying and seeking God's face can be a powerful exercise, especially when you're listening to other people who are seeking the same thing you are. I love this when we do this as an elders group or as a church board. When we're earnestly seeking direction from God, and we come together and it's, okay, what have you heard? How has your heart been directed as we've considered this matter? And you get their take on what's going on, and you find that your picture of the decision or, what it is that you've been considering as a group of leaders, you find that it's expanded, and you go, wow, I didn't think about that. God showed you that? And you get this broadened picture of what it is that God is saying. And so in the midst of that, then, you begin to learn to trust God more because you see that it's not just your take on it. It's an expanded body. And as such then, wow, there is something to be said for having that larger group around you. Because here's the other thing. Sometimes when we're learning to trust God, we can go off the rails by thinking we've got a lock on what God is saying. A wise person learns to trust that other people can hear from God too. And so in that broadened counsel, again, God brings people around us like guardrails, but then he brings them around us to point us in a larger sort of expanded way in the direction that he wants us to go. And it's an incredible thing. The other thing that we can find with this surrounding is that when we are in the midst of hard times, having people who have walked through times that are like that as well can be such a powerful thing. They can help you to lean on God, to trust in Him when you're scrambling. It's a beautiful, beautiful picture. One more thing. And it goes along with what I just said. Determining to seek God's guidance in the midst of hard times can be an exercise unto itself. We need to lean into God and use the challenges we face, the events that come into our lives as, dare I say, and I'm not meaning to be trite when I say this, to use those times like a laboratory for our faith. Our faith grows when it's tested, when it's challenged. Think of it this way. Faith is like a muscle. You have to use it and you have to push it for it to develop and grow. When we go to the gym, which I don't do, I exercise just not like that. If you were to go to a gym, you'd be working out and you'd be putting your muscles under strain. You'd be pushing them. And we need to see our lives as in that same sort of way, like a gym, where our faith muscles are given the opportunity every day to trust God for what's going on around us. Because let's face it, if we're not trusting God, we're trusting something else. And it's often ourselves. And if the waters get deep and the circumstances get hard, we can begin to get fearful. We can begin to loathe our existence. We can get ground down, depressed even, because this weight of what we're trying to move becomes so onerous. Trusting in the Lord means that we're not trusting in ourselves. Again, I'm not saying this in a light and sort of, airy-fairy kind of fashion. We don't know what 2023 is going to hold. But I can say with absolute certainty that there will be times for each of us in this year to learn to trust God more. We are going to face circumstances. Some of them absolutely, completely, totally beyond our control. And maybe that goes for a lot more than what we might think. We become very good at thinking that we've got things under control. And it's only when we're really, scared or pushed that we realize, I don't have a lid on this as much as I think I do. 2023 will inevitably bring circumstances, situations, events that will be beyond us. What are we going to choose to do in those moments? Are we going to lean into God? Are we going to put to the test the ways that we have learned to trust Him, hearing His voice, seeing Him around us, becoming close to Him personally? Do we have a team around us, a group of people, and whether it's our family or whether it's a broader context, do we have ones we can lean on who will point us in the direction and keep us in the direction of seeking God and trusting Him? We need to develop those. We need to see 2023 as that learning situation. And as such, then, we need to determine that we will seek God no matter what comes our way. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Not divided, but definitively looking to Him, learning to do it better, if we were to establish that as one of our goals for 2023, I'm convinced of this. Number one, God will meet us in that goal because this is the thing that he wants for us. But then secondly, I'm absolutely convinced that we will be blown away by how God meets with us in this year. Let's make it our prayer. Father, help us to learn to trust you better. Lord, I think there are times when we're like that person with one foot on the land and one foot in the boat, and it's kind of a we aren't, and we know that sooner or later it's going to get to the point where we can't keep it together. Father, help us to grow in our faith and in our trust of you. Lord, bring those disciplines into our lives that will encourage this. Bring people around us. Help us to do that, to bring people around us who will help us trust in you. And Lord, when circumstances arise, situations, events, and they undoubtedly will, help us to lean into you for guidance, direction, for those guardrails that would keep us from going off the rails. But Lord, in all of this, to find that you are the faithful God that we can lean on, and that trusting you will always be rewarded. Father, thank you for this. And we enter this new year with this in our hearts as a goal. Lord, meet us in this goal, I pray. Amen. God bless you.
It's all about you. It's all about Jesus. I'm sorry, Lord, for the thing I've made. When it's all about you, it's all about you, Jesus.